Thanks, Barbara, and thank you, everybody, and welcome to this session looking at the role of business and investment in social impact. And I am delighted to be joined today by Ian Marchant. Ian has a wealth of experience across the energy sector, including his leadership roles in business and advisory groups such as Scotland's 2020 Climate Group and the Energy Institute. A track record of positive impact investments and purposeful business. So welcome, Ian. It's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you for those kind words.
Now, over the next hour or so, Ian, I'd love to hear your views, as with the delegates, on what role business and investment can have in making that positive social impact. And obviously, over the last 2 days of the conference, there's been a real focus on net zero, but positive social impact, of course, is much wider, I guess, and thinking about the UN's 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm sure we'll touch on that later on. I'm sure the audience and the delegates will also have a number of questions that they will want to put to you, so I will ensure that we have time at the end, and I'm sure Barbara can come in and bring those into the conversation as well. So to kick off, when you and I talked before, you raised a point, I think, that while every little helps to make a difference, there is a need to really focus on the things that will have the biggest impact. Now, my understanding from earlier conversation is that perhaps those big things that make an impact can be identified as two things. Firstly, around behaviours, how organisations behave, and secondly, more of a sector-specific focus, maybe on what we build. Have I got that right? Would you say these have to be the priority?
Well, firstly, I agree with the supposition behind your question. We should focus on the things that matter. I'm not quite as extreme as Bill Gates. If you've read his book, he very much says if this can't take 1% of global climate emissions, we shouldn't be bothering with it. But I think that principle of focus on what matters is crucial. And I say for any business people listening, focus on what matters to your business. What impact do you have? Many businesses don't know what impacts, social, environmental impacts they have. So the first thing is know what impacts you have and therefore take action on it. But fundamentally, there's two things that will have to change in the next 30 years and have started to change over the last 30 years. How we behave and what we build. I'm going to take the second one first because that's more a focus of business investment, what we build, how we build it, whether we build it at all, what we make, that sort of a physical activity that economies depend upon. So in energy, it's do we build renewables or do we build more fossil fuel wells? That will determine the carbon emissions for the next 50 years, those investment decisions. Housing, whether we build a code 1 house or a code 3 house, will affect carbon emissions probably for the next 100 years. What car you buy in the next 6 months will determine carbon emissions for the next 7 to 10 years. So what we build is, and what we buy and what we get constructed on our behalf is fundamental. And two of the big challenges are cement, concrete, and steel. How do we decarbonise those key building materials? Because if we can't, we've got a real problem of getting net zero in the economy. So there are those big decisions that will require research and investment, but they're sort of periodic. As a householder, you make one of those decisions maybe every 5 years or so. Businesses are quite often involved in them all the time. However, the other side of what really matters is how we behave. And that's thousands of decisions. We all make hundreds of decisions every day, some knowingly, some not knowingly. Do you put the light on? Don't you put the light on? What temperature do you set your thermostat in your home? In businesses, who hosts your web services? Do you know what their carbon footprint is? How are your employees getting to work? So there are, I say, hundreds of decisions we all make as individuals and as businesses every day, and they will affect the social and environmental impact every day as well. So there are things you can do that affect carbon emissions for a generation. The things that you do that affect carbon emissions for an hour, you need to be thinking about both.
Okay, so it's really all obviously about mindset. So, how do you go about and how do businesses go around changing that mindset within the organisation to ensure that what they do is purposeful? For example, a large corporate, how do we start to see that change and enable that change in large corporates?
Well, I think it starts from what's the organisation's core purpose. I'm a great believer in purpose led organisations, clearly establishing what your purpose is, what your values are as an organisation. So I remember in my SSE days, one of our key values was sustainability, making sure that what we did was fit for the future as well as the current. So your core purpose and your core values are fundamental to this. Then I think it's the tone from the top. Leadership really matters in something like this. The CEO, the board, the senior management team, the court of a university, the dean of the business school. It's what you do matters. What stake in the ground you put. If you say every proposal, I want to understand its environmental and social impact. You start saying that, the organisation starts to adjust and realise what's important. However, you also need to know where the coalition of the willing are in an organisation. There usually is a coalition of the willing, people throughout the organisation who get what you're trying to do. They're quite often the younger members of the team, the newer recruits, but not always. To understand where your coalition of the willing are, but also understand where your either active blockers or your passive resistors are, and working out how you overcome them. And I can remember, again, I'm going to use an SSE story to illustrate that point. The guys in the generation engineering department couldn't get what they needed to do. They had no focus. But when I came up with the idea of halving carbon intensity of our generation every 10 years, they got it because it gave them a framework in which to think. A long-term view, because engineers are long-term, and it gave them some metrics, some numbers, so they could work out any investment decision, what would it do to the carbon intensity of our fleet? Be it an acquisition, a new plant, or enhancements or modifications to existing plant. They needed a framework. So they were passive resistors because they didn't know how to cope. When you gave them a framework they understood, they got on board and became actually leading advocates of what we were trying to do. So understanding the different constituencies in an organisation and how they work is a key part of that.
So it's having that sort of common language, really, I guess, to enable that framework and then that partnership and
Yes,
collaboration working within the organisation.
yeah. Well,
And
and
presumably,
you mentioned the UN Development Goals, and I think
mhm.
they're a very powerful, simple framework. There are 17 of them. Most organisations can readily identify the one, two, three where they can positive impact, and the one, two, or three where their operations can be make a negative impact if they get it wrong. And just having that common language about which UN development goals are matter to you as an organisation allows you to have conversations within the organisation, but also externally with your providers of capital, with other stakeholders. Say these are the things that matter to us, but actually we don't say the other development goals don't matter, but they're not for us.
Okay, and you talked there about other stakeholders as well, and presumably when organisations and leaders work together with their stakeholders, whether that's other large corporations or small, medium-sized enterprises, even consumers, it gives them the ability, does it, to sort of leverage that collective capacity and impact going forward?
Yes, I mean the the old idea of the corporation being like a medieval fortress with a moat and a drawbridge you could pull up, and self-sufficiency in the answers always being within, um, is just wrong and not fit for purpose in today's society. The need to decarbonise our economy is almost the biggest disruption we've seen since the Industrial Revolution. Actually, if you think the Industrial Revolution was largely an energy revolution, how do we harness fossil fuels in both how we got around and what we built? The answers to the problems don't lie in any one place, in any one organisation. Our economy is far too complex. The technology um, is more sophisticated, and it almost certainly means bringing different things together. So organisations need to get better at collaborating, management and staff working together to solve the problems. The large company working with a small startup company who can move faster in some R&D, the working with its customers and its supply chain, because most innovations are out there. It's just a case of putting the dots together. Working with government at all levels. In some cases, it might be the local authority. Where if you're trying to put a sustainable drainage scheme in, working with the local authority is what matters. If you're trying to decarbonise the whole of your electricity system, you need to be doing it regional or national governments, or even supranational governments. So businesses need to cooperate, and they need to work out how to collaborate with universities, and universities need to work out how to collaborate with um, businesses. I mean, it's a long held mantra. We need to get better at that, so that the bright ideas that your students and professors are working on can get deployed. Because what business is great at is taking an idea, improving it, and driving for mass adoption. Academics are great at coming up with those bright ideas, and we've got to work out how the various communities can work together. Because if we try and do it on our own, we'll fail.
Absolutely. Yes, and it's interesting. Of course, universities can and do make an impact here, and there is absolutely a critical role for driving that research and
Yes.
innovation that we play in, creating that space to facilitate that
Yes.
successful innovation. And I guess it's around cross-sector learning and collaboration. I mean, obviously, listening to the various sessions over the last couple of days, we've heard around impactful research and things like urban innovation, in the development of sustainable cities, in using technologies to reduce emissions, improve efficiency, and so on and so forth. So lots of great work going on at Napier and other universities across the UK and across the world. But there's obviously a need, as you've said, to do more, to encourage more of this. So what do we do? What do we, as universities and businesses, how do we increase that level of impact, increase that pace? Is there other things that should happen? Is there a role of government to facilitate an environment? How do we grow it?
Let me come to the role of government in a minute, because the first thing I think we need to, sometimes to go quicker, we need to step back. We need to make sure there's trust between the various people within a partnership. So um, trust generally comes from getting to know. Why do you trust some of your friends, and why do you not trust others of them? Because you've got to know them, and you know on what subjects to trust them. And building trust is generally an active step, and frequently partnerships start trying to do too much too quickly and don't build that trust. So the first thing to go quickly is make sure there's a good foundation for the relationship, which is not about the detailed terms about how the IP and the royalties might work. It's do we have a shared vision, some shared values, and do we trust each other so that as things change, we will work together to solve them. That applies to any relationship, be it a university and a business, a large business, a small business, a customer and a supplier. It also works for government. And governments need to actively work on building trust with business and vice versa. So the comments of Boris Johnson yesterday were not helpful. Okay, he's preaching to his choir, the Conservative Party, but just bashing business does not build trust between business um, and government. Some of the best things that I saw done when in my time as CEO were where the conversations could happen quietly behind the scenes. An understanding between business and government was reached, and the two sides trusted each other to do what they both said. And I have specific examples which I can't share because that would undermine the confidentiality and trust, where things were happening. And I see it again down south in the water industry. You mentioned in your introduction, I chair Thames Water. Yeah, a company with a troubled track record. But actually, I can see in some communities, local authorities, there is trust and they work together. And there are some where there's just a dialogue of the deaf. So that first point I make about the role of government is to make sure there is a high degree of trust within the people that matter on these particular social environmental issues. Then, more generally on the role of government, there's a quote I like from Thomas Paine, the intellectual father of the American Revolution, who said the role of government is to lead, follow, or get out of the way. And frequently, business feels like actually what government does is get in the way. Government needs to be very clear on this I'm leading, on this I'm happy to follow, and this I just get out of the way. It's working. I don't need to get involved. And I think if governments took that lens and were very clear, we lead here, we follow here, we get out of the way, then uh, things will be better. But then there's obligations on the other side of the fence. Do not pitch up to government just asking for more money. That's not. There isn't a magic money tree, or whatever you want to say. Government's resources are finite. That will remain the case with the amount of money that's been pumped into the economy through COVID. Governments of all persuasions will have to be careful in what they spend. So don't just pitch up expecting more money. Work out how they can targetedly help you, and more importantly, how you can help them. What are the challenges that they're facing as elected representatives of our country? How can you help them? And you should make more offers than you make asks. So there are obligations on both sides of that equation. And I think businesses frequently forget the second half of the equation. Trade associations could be, they get a moment with the minister and the sun, so it's ask, ask, ask. It should be offer, offer, ask.
Okay, great advice. So I think just to sort of summarise that, you talked about having this common goals and the common language of collaboration to build up the trust, and then looking at government, and working with government obviously to support them as well as them creating that environment. But what about stability? I mean, obviously with government, with political parties, they're only in power for so long, then they move on. So how do we create that lasting environment, the sort of the framework that will span party political politics, if you like, that really helps drive it forward?
It is a challenge because the typical term of office of a government minister is a couple of years, and the typical term of office of government is 4 to 5 years. And the investment decisions that I was talking about earlier is 5, 10, 15, 20 to 100 years. But governments can do stuff, and I'm going to use the example back in 2009 with the first Climate Change Act in Scotland, which came up with the 42% reduction by 2020 and the 80% by 2050. That created a clear long-term framework. It was passed virtually unanimously through the Scottish Parliament. There was cross-party support. Businesses said, okay, we can see clearly the direction of travel. We are going to invest and organise our businesses on the back of it. I saw that within SSE. Um, and it created a framework. Actually, government did not know how Scotland was going to meet 42%. It knew it could see 34, and there was a debate about what that's going to be. Actually, we achieved 51%. So when government leads by setting a framework and then follows and gets out of the way, actually societies and businesses and organisations and individuals can achieve more than they thought, which means that after 7 or 8 years, we could ratchet the climate change targets up again to 100% carbon reduction by 2045. So again, there is a clear framework now, and all the businesses that I know are using that and say, when can we be at net zero? So they've accepted the framework logic of 2050 is as light as we can be. When can we be? And I've got businesses 2030, 35, 40, 45, depending on where they are. But all businesses that I'm aware of are using that lens to work out their long-term strategy, and in some cases their investment decisions today.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting. Can I take you back to what you were talking about before when you're talking about, investment decisions and obviously then the role of frameworks and innovation. Innovation obviously is going to play a massive part in certain sectors, particularly in order to achieve their goals of net zero or in an ideal world carbon zero. Um, but what about construction? You talked about steel and concrete. Um, is zero carbon construction possible? Is that actually going to happen?
Um,
How do
it's
we how do we get there?
it's not a subject I know particularly a lot about. Um, it it has to be possible. Um, the ultimate renewable energy source that we have is human ingenuity. We as a species have for millennia adapted to the environments we've found and found solutions to the problems, some of which we've created, some of which we've discovered. Um, so you have to believe it's possible. But the answer isn't necessarily with the incumbent players. If you, I liken this to the great horse manure crisis of 1894. This is a London example. Yeah. London was drowning in horse manure because of the number of horses and the horse carcasses that was in the streets, and they reckoned that London would drown in horse manure within 20 years. Actually, at that very point when the articles were written in the papers at the time about this crisis, at that very point, there were men in sheds designing the automobile. And the first cars were being sold, 3 here, 5 there, 4 there. So the answer wasn't with the horse breeders or the manufacturers of carriages, it was men in sheds. And frequently, innovation has happened at the fringes of society. It was the same in the revolution around the second revolution of IT. We were so mainframe dependent. I mean, I can remember when I started work, there were no compute. There was a mainframe. There were no microcomputers, but at that time you had Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in a garage. You had Hewlett and Packard in a garage. You had Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer in garages and sheds, working on the IT kit that we know today. So the answer is out there on steel, on concrete. It's finding the person with the idea, usually combining them with other ideas, and then getting them into a economic entity that can deploy it, which might be an incumbent or it might be a new entrant. It might have state funding, it might not have state funding. So I'm by nature an optimist. The answer's there. We will find it. We've just got to work out how to get it with momentum quickly. We've seen it in electric vehicles. We've seen it in offshore wind. We're seeing it in grid batteries. That momentum. We need to see more of it more quickly. There is a quote, and I can't remember it's by, and I'm getting it wrong. But to paraphrase, it's change happens later than you think, but then it happens faster than you think. So we tend to think that change will be a straight line. It isn't, it's an S curve. And it feels like on some things, like on renewable energy, we're at that accelerating point. But on things like construction, steel, we're still in that foothills.
In the early stages. So it goes back to, again, the importance, doesn't it, of collaboration and building those networks. So the large organizations, the small enterprises, the academics, the inventors with the great ideas can pool that knowledge and work together to find. So, for the bit. Carry on.
One of the other frameworks I have in my head about innovation, it's actually there are three stages in any innovation. They all begin with I. There is invention, the bright spark. That might typically be in a university. Then there is the improver, who takes that idea and says, if we combine it with this other idea or we tweak it here, we've got a better. Inventors want to move on to the next project. Improvers take something and make it better. And then we have the implementers. Typically, at business, better at implementing. You need all three stages to get innovation to happen. They are usually not in the same place. They are almost inevitably not in the same person. By character, I'm an improver. I love taking an idea that someone has. Hang on a minute, we could combine it with what I heard 2 days ago, and that would be even better. But then I want to move on. Where's the next idea I can put together? So I tend to be an improver. But good organisations can find people at all three. Universities typically have inventors, occasional improvers. You don't have implementers. Businesses tend not to have inventors, but they have implementers. And it's about bringing those three together.
Okay. And then I guess one of the ways that we can bring those three together, apart from building that network of networks, if you like, and the trusted relationships, is also about changing the mindset through innovation and education, upskilling, sort of that cradle to grave development approach, so that everybody at every stage of their working life and within business would start to join those dots. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, that again, this is where I can turn the tables back on you, Gail. Actually, business schools have a key role in that. What are you educating both the sort of typical undergraduate who is studying business in its various forms, but more particularly the master's students, the MBA students, the other people who are coming in on various continuing professional education or what are you teaching them about the importance of innovation, the importance of collaboration, the ecological emergency? Because actually, you have a role in helping people think about how to solve problems and what they can do, what their strengths are, how they need to. So everybody needs to be thinking around that, and I mean it is an interesting challenge, isn't it? That universities are meant to be our cradle of change and revolution, and yet they're the same as they were 50 years ago or even 500 years ago. You teach the same subjects in the same silos in the same way. So interesting. Physician, heal thyself. Maybe you need to be more revolutionary as an institution. Anyway, that's a bit off
Yeah.
topic.
Well, just to respond to that, yes, I mean, I guess education, higher education is similar. Obviously, a lot of organisations have been around for many, many years. Napier's been around for, well, since 1967. Um, so yeah, there are some things that haven't changed, but I think we do as a sector, we have worked very hard, and with Napier, and certainly within the business school, but across all schools, I absolutely buy into the fact it's not just about the knowledge. Yes, research and innovation, looking at solving problems from a theoretical perspective is very important. The knowledge of a great degree is what we do, but absolutely the skills that we have